Now that you know the parts of the female reproductive cycle, we can start looking at what happens. It's a complex cycle both throughout the lifetime and the monthly cycle. So first we're going to get an overview of the lifetime of the female reproductive cycle. We begin with a female fetus. A female fetus is already making eggs in her ovary. So before she's even born, her body is already preparing to reproduce and make those eggs. So this is that parent cell that we talked about, and it is going to begin the process of meiosis I. But before it divides, it pauses and it goes dormant. So the chromosomes are copied, the crossing over occurs, it's all ready to divide, but it pauses and goes dormant just before it divides. It also gets this structure around it. You can see I have this green outline here. This is called a follicle. A follicle encloses the cell. So when a girl is born, she has 1.5 million of these what are called primary oocytes. So the primary oocyte is that cell paused in meiosis I. And each one is enclosed in a primordial follicle. And that is her lifetime supply of eggs. So never again will the ovaries go through this process. The 1.5 million you're born with, that's it. You'll never make any more. Then we have childhood. During childhood, everything just remains dormant. But you have a process called atrasia. Most of those 1.5 million eggs that you're born with die. In fact, it's 1.4 million of them die. In atrasia, most of the primary oocytes die. So this represents the ones that die. Only 400,000 of the 1.5 million will live. Then we have puberty. So this next part is puberty to menopause. So you enter this stage of life with those 400,000 primary oocytes. So this is our 400,000 primary oocytes in primordial follicles. Now you go through a monthly cycle, and the ovaries take turns in this monthly cycle. So 1 month it's the right ovary, the next month it's the left ovary, and they go back and forth. And each month, about 20 of these oocytes will break their dormancy. So we're going to have 20 of these break dormancy. And they're going to continue through the process of meiosis 1. But as they do, 19 of them will die. And now remember, these numbers are just averages. It's not always exactly 19 every month or always exactly 20 every month. But in general, all but one die. So you have 19 die. You have 1 that survives to finish meiosis 1. And notice here you have another little structure here. This structure is a polar body. So I'll explain what that is. When the cell divides, instead of splitting down the half like what normally happens, it splits like this. You get an uneven division. So then one cell is really big and one is really small. The really big one is your secondary oocyte. And the really small one is a polar body. The polar body just dies. It's just a dumping ground for the other chromosomes. Every time you divide, you split up the chromosomes. You have to have a place to send those other chromosomes. And that's all the polar body is. It's just the chromosomes and a tiny bit of cytoplasm. All of the other organelles and structures stay with that secondary oocyte. I'll explain more about that later. So then you have this one survivor. Then it gets ovulated. So you can see here, the follicle ruptures. And here is your secondary oocyte. So it is released from the follicle. And it goes to the fallopian tube. Then this is where a sperm would fertilize it, in the fallopian tube. Then, if it gets fertilized, then it does meiosis 2. Remember, meiosis has 2 divisions. So here you can see, here's the sperm inside the egg. So only a fertilized egg does meiosis 2. So if it is fertilized, it does meiosis 2. So it divides again. There's your other polar body that you get when it divides. And then you end up with a mature ovum. And this whole section we're going to go through in more detail on the next table. This is just an overview of what happens puberty to menopause. But basically, you're going through this monthly cycle of releasing eggs. Then the last part here is menopause. This is when the ovaries go back to being dormant. And then there's just nothing else happening. The whole reproductive cycle shuts down and stops happening. Okay, so this part is an overview of the lifetime. So a fetus makes her eggs. She's born with those primary oocytes. Childhood, nothing happens. It's dormant, and most of those eggs are dying. Then from puberty to menopause is the monthly cycle of some of those 400,000 breaking dormancy, finishing meiosis 1. One of them survives, gets ovulated. If it is fertilized, then it does meiosis 2. And when you do meiosis, you get those polar bodies. So now we'll look at a little more detail of some of this stuff. The whole thing with polar bodies. When you have your cells divide, you have chromosomes here, you have chromosomes here. You would have 23 of these on each side. Normally, cell division occurs right down the middle and you get 2 equal cells. But with eggs, that's not what happens. You get division like this, so that you get 1 big cell and 1 polar body. Then this is what gets ovulated. So here's our ovulated cell. If a sperm comes along and fertilizes it, then it puts a chromosome here, divides off to the side again, so that then you would have 23 single chromosomes and another polar body. The reason you do this, there's a couple of reasons. This produces a large egg. So the uneven cytokinesis produces 1 large egg with 23 chromosomes. All the organelles and it's packed with nutrients. So it's kind of your starter pack. The sperm pretty much just brings chromosomes. The egg has to bring everything else. The egg has the starter pack for starting a new body. And all of the organelles, all of your organelles came from your mom. In fact, there's a neat thing. There's mitochondrial DNA. Remember mitochondria that make ATP? They have DNA in them. And it matches your mom's and her mom's and her mom's and so on. So you can trace ancestry through the maternal line by looking at mitochondrial DNA. So all of your organelles came from the egg, came from your mom. So next Mother's Day, give your mom a card that says, "Thank you for the organelles." Okay, here's an ovary. And this ovary is showing the entire cycle. So we're looking at 28 days in this ovary. And we're going to look at phases. So right here, these represent those primordial follicles with the primary oocytes. Then this is the part where they break dormancy and develop. Then you get down to just your 1 survivor. Here's still your 1 survivor. And it finishes meiosis 1. Then here is ovulation, where the follicle ruptures and it releases the primary oocyte. It's a secondary oocyte now because it did meiosis 1. Then, after the follicle ruptures, you have this and this are a corpus luteum. This is the follicle after it ruptures. Then finally, this last part is the corpus albicans. This is the follicle when it dies. And this is a repeating cycle. So we're looking at 28 days worth of events here in this ovary. So the next chart, we're going to go through and chart this out, and we're going to keep referring back to this picture. Okay, so we start off days 1 through 5 are the follicular phase. So that is up here. This part is days 1 through 5. This is when, so we're on about this area here. This is when you have those follicles breaking dormancy and beginning meiosis 1. Or I'm sorry, continuing meiosis 1. During this time, there is a low level of secretion from the ovary. So you have low estrogen and progesterone. Because these levels are low, if there was no fertilized egg, it's going to cause the uterus to shed its lining. So over on the left here, we're saying there was no fertilized egg. So in this case, the uterus is shedding its lining. And this is called the menstrual phase. Over on the right, we do have, you can see here, an implanted embryo. So if you have an implanted embryo, the uterus will not shed its lining. And we'll go into more detail later of how the uterus knows this, how you maintain or shed the lining. Then, now we're going to go on assuming we're going to follow this path that the uterus shed its lining, and so we have to start the cycle over again. So days 6 through 13 are kind of this area. We're still in that follicular phase. So we still have the oocyte working on meiosis 1. And during this time, the hypothalamus is in charge. And the hypothalamus is stimulating the anterior pituitary to secrete follicle-stimulating hormone. And follicle-stimulating hormone is what's causing the meiosis to occur here. As the meiosis is occurring, the follicle secretes estrogen. And that estrogen goes to the uterus and tells it to build endometrium. So you have this whole chain of command. You have the hypothalamus stimulating the anterior pituitary to secrete FSH, which stimulates the follicle to secrete estrogen, which stimulates the uterus to build its endometrium. And in the uterus, this is called the proliferative phase. This is when it starts building up a new endometrium. Then, if we continue on, now we have day 14 is this part, ovulation. So now the hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete LH, which is luteinizing hormone. LH is what stimulates the follicle to rupture, and it releases the oocyte to the fallopian tube. Then we're ready to move on to days 15 to 28. That is this part where you have the corpus luteum. So remember, the corpus luteum is the follicle after it has released the egg. So this is the luteal phase for the ovary. And this corpus luteum is going to secrete estrogen and progesterone. And estrogen and progesterone is going to go to the uterus, and it's going to tell the uterus to thicken the endometrium. So this in the uterus is the secretory phase. This is when the endometrium thickens. So there's two possibilities of what can be going on here. On the left, there's no sperm fertilizing the egg. Over on the right, we do have fertilization. So you can see right here, there's the sperm fertilizing the egg. It takes about a week for that fertilized egg, which is now called a zygote, to travel through the fallopian tube to the uterus. And then here, about a week later, you have an embryo implants in the uterus. Once it does, the embryo secretes HCG, which is human chorionic gonadotropin. So if you have an embryo here, you're going to have a hormone called HCG coming from the embryo. HCG goes to the corpus luteum, and it keeps it alive. So remember when we had the corpus albicans, that was the dead corpus luteum. When the corpus luteum dies, and then you get a corpus albicans, that's when you lose estrogen and progesterone and the uterus sheds its lining, back up in day 1 there. If you have an embryo and you have HCG, HCG keeps the corpus luteum alive. And if you keep the corpus luteum alive, you keep the estrogen and progesterone. And so if you keep estrogen and progesterone, the uterus keeps the lining. So just to go over and kind of explain some of this. Back here in days 1 through 5, that's the menstrual cycle. That's when the uterus is shedding its lining. This is when you have the corpus albicans and you have the loss of estrogen and progesterone. When the corpus luteum dies, it stops secreting estrogen and progesterone, and that loss of estrogen and progesterone is what makes the uterus shed its lining. If you have fertilization and there's an embryo implanted in the uterus, the embryo secretes HCG. HCG is life support for the corpus luteum, so it keeps the corpus luteum alive. And as long as the corpus luteum stays alive, it will keep secreting estrogen and progesterone. So as long as estrogen and progesterone stay high, the uterus does not shed its lining. And then that's when pregnancy occurs. If there's no embryo there, then the corpus luteum has no HCG to keep it alive. The corpus luteum dies, becomes a corpus albicans. You lose the estrogen and progesterone, and the uterus sheds its lining.